Hey everyone, welcome to the Them Before Us podcast. I'm your host, Jen Friesen, and we're continuing our IVF series with our engagement director, patient Sunny. Today's guest joins us to chat about the future of IVF. Ari Schulman is editor of The New Atlantis, a journal of technology and society, and a fellow at Cosmos Ventures. Ari, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
To kick us off, can you just introduce yourself a little bit to our audience, maybe some of your educational career background, and then how did you get interested in artificial reproductive technologies?
Sure. So how I got interested in artificial reproductive technologies, it's a sort of a fifth level sidetrack from an original career track. So my educational background, I studied computer science and English at the University of Texas at Austin. And I was originally a physics major for a little while. I was like a science kid. That was my thing. And then I like to read on the side. But I was going down a science and technology track, and I was in a natural sciences honors program at the University of Texas. And we took a class. I personally was very interested in kind of philosophical. I didn't understand this at the time, but they were philosophical questions about science and technology, the kinds that you get answered through pop science books by Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson and so forth. What is our place in the universe? Do we have free will? Are emotions real or an illusion? These kinds of things. So I was interested in those kinds of questions without really understanding that those were more philosophical questions than they really were properly scientific ones. So I was a science major, and we took a class on the singularity, which is the name for a hypothetical future in which technology accelerates at an ever-increasing rate. And so it compounds upon itself, and it reaches a kind of explosion point. So if you ever see hockey puck graphs of population explosion or global temperature or something like that, where it's kind of going along slowly and then it explodes, the idea is that technological progress is going to do that. And there will be a post-human future where we transcend the limitations of our biology, we overcome death, we overcome suffering and material scarcity, and we overcome all of these other limitations of our being. I took this class, I was, 19 or 20 years old. It was just a seminar on the side of other classes. We just kind of sat around chatting about things. And I was the only one in this class who thought that this sounded bad. And like a future where we lose something of ourselves. And it sounded to me like not only a bad, but just a meaningless future, a future where the context in which the things that mean things to us are no longer there. But I was the only one in my class who felt this way. And that was a bit of an alarm bell for me about the career path I was going down and the milieu that I was going to be a part of. I had a friend, my best friend since high school, Brian Boyd, who's now a moral theologian, who was interning at the New Atlantis, which is the science and technology magazine. He recommended that I go intern there as well, and I did many years ago now. And many years later, I'm now running it. But my interest in transhumanism grew out of that, right? So that's the singularity. The singularity is a prophecy about the future, a prediction. Transhumanism is the ideology that says that this is good and desirable and is something that we should be working towards. Assisted reproduction is it's a present version. It's a small, but I think significant present reality in which we are already going down a transhumanist path up to a point. I don't want to be too hasty and say that all assisted reproduction falls under that category, but there are certainly some assisted reproduction techniques that are problematic in that way because they represent the beginning of going beyond our human limitations.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you. So last fall, you wrote an article in the New York Times about how the world isn't ready for what comes after IVF. You wrote, consider in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG, a technology under development that would allow the creation of eggs or sperm from ordinary body tissue like skin cells. Men could become genetic mothers, women could be fathers, and people could be the offspring of 1, 3, 4, or any number of parents. So explain for our audience, what is IVG and how could it lead to genetically motherless or fatherless children or three-parent children?
Right. So in vitro gametogenesis is a fancy way of saying creating sperm and egg cells in a lab. So in vitro meaning in a lab or in a lab dish as opposed to in the body. Gamete is the term for sperm and egg cells, and genesis meaning creation. So that is not possible right now, to my knowledge, you can create all kinds of cells in a lab. You can create various kinds of adult tissues from other adult stem cells. You can create, controversially about 20 years ago, began the ability to create essentially every cell in the body from embryonic stem cells. So you take human embryos and you manipulate the ways that they're. So every cell in our body has the same DNA, right? An embryonic stem cell allows you to create any adult tissue from that embryo. To my knowledge, at that time, the type of cell that was excluded from that was sperm and egg cells, which are different in structure. The sperm cells, I'm not a biologist here, so I'm stepping a little bit at the edge of my knowledge here, but I believe that the sperm cells don't contain the full complement of chromosomes. And so there were just these technical and biological limitations on the ability to create the cells that you use to create new life. This new technology, this new technique, it promises to be able to get around that. It's been done up to it's sort of done at a proof of concept level in a lab. It isn't quite yet ready for prime time, but it's at that sort of early stage. It opens up a bunch of new possibilities. I can kind of circle back and say a little bit more on this, but I think IVG is both troubling in itself, but it's also interesting and instructive because unlike other assisted reproductive technologies, it's hard to find a precedent for it earlier in the human experience. It seems like a really novel thing. And it is novel because it would allow you to create an embryo and a baby and a person who has something other than one genetic mother and one genetic father, right? So for all of the sophisticated assisted reproduction technologies we've had before, like surrogacy or IVF or genetic selection, which involves sometimes kind of shifting our understanding of who parents are. We always understand that there is a single genetic mother and a single genetic father, even if that isn't the mother and father or the parents that are actually raising a child. This would change that. So it would allow, for example, same-sex couples to have a child that is the genetic child of both members of the couple. It would also allow for what's called multiplex parenting, which is where you're combining the DNA from more than two people to create a baby. And I think it would also allow for singleton parenting, which is that you could become solely the genetic parent of a child. If you think through the implications of that, those kinds of arrangements have never existed before. Again, I would have to read up more fully on the technical details of this, but my understanding of this is that the way that this would work would be that you could create sperm and eggs from the adult cells of anyone. So you would have possibilities like somebody a man becoming the genetic mother of a child, or a woman becoming the genetic father of a child. I think there are actually chromosomal limitations that would limit some of those possibilities, but that's the sort of the path that you start going down, and that's the mechanism by which you would be able to do that.
It's interesting. We talked about, I think it was with Dr. Prentice as well. Our next question is about Dr. Prentice, but we talked about how with some of the gene editing that we're doing, they're saying if we could edit out cerebral palsy and you could clip that somehow out of someone's genes, that he said the problem is they were able to do something along those lines in the genes with one kind of disability, but then it made the embryos more prone to, I think it was like West Nile virus or something. It made them more prone to the next kind of disability or illness. So what's so fascinating about some of these thoughts about our technology is we just have no comprehension of what something like that would actually do to a human being. And it's kind of like human experimentation, right? So I guess there's so many ethical questions, but since it's hypothetical right now and the technology might just advance the point, well, you can't say we can't do it yet because we can't even do it. So, but what happens? Do we create humans and then we start talking about the ethics of it? That seems like what's happening with just IVF and things right now.
I think that's largely correct. I would say that's not an issue that I focus on greatly, just because it seems fairly clear to me that nobody really decides their position on these technologies based on those kinds of side effect issues. They are at most entry points for deeper and more underlying ethical questions. Right. This applies to tech debates of all kinds. When you're talking about nuclear power or raw milk or surrogacy, existing artificial reproduction technologies. Usually the way that people decide these things is that they either, they believe that this is an underlying way, a way of advancing the human good, or a way of kind of disrupting the good, and undertaking an immoral or a kind of hubristic act. Those side effects can become useful ways to kind of to think about and look at and see the manifestations of that underlying critique. But if you believe that the underlying act is good, the side effect issue is kind of a thing to manage. It doesn't usually become dispositive in these public debates unless there's really overwhelming and obvious side effects. But it is true that within the ordinary conventions of medical ethics, this is a form of human experimentation. I think you can credibly make the case that when you don't know what the kinds of side effects are, it constitutes a form of human experimentation in which patients can't consent. And the critical question then becomes, are you intervening therapeutically for the benefit of a patient? Because that's when it's ethical to do that within the standards of ordinary medical ethics. And then that turns on questions about who is the patient in this? Are we talking about a potential person who doesn't exist yet, or an existing person with a deficiency? That whole framework, in my view, has largely not really been followed in the assisted reproduction debates. That we tend to kind of talk around these things and not try to think about or really rigorously apply them, especially as it applies to the beginning of life and the new creation of life that doesn't exist yet. It's uncomfortable in a lot of ways, and in some ways it's just a limited way to think about the meaning of what that act is.
Yeah, well, and your point about, it's experimentation if you're doing it without patient consent, where you don't know the full implications. And I think it's important too to consider, in these scenarios, the child that's being created through this hypothetical technology, they're not consenting at all. They have no say in what's happening. And I think that that's a piece that sometimes gets lost in some of the assisted reproductive technology debates, where we tend to focus on, well, did the parents consent? Did the adults consent? But the attention gets shifted away from how the child is being impacted and whether or not they had any say in, how the process that went into their creation might affect them later on.
So really crucial, that's very well said, and a really crucial question to ask, an overarching question to ask about all of these technologies is, who is the technique for? In whose interest is it, and what is the nature of that interest? It is for the existence, the therapies that are licit, even if they involve risks or unknown side effects, are ones that are healing a detectable, a known deficit, or disease or disorder within an existing patient. So, for example, most ethicists, including myself, if I want to flatter myself, an ethicist, would say that genetic engineering, so CRISPR, used to correct genetic illnesses or to treat genetic illnesses in adults and also in fetuses and even in embryos that already exist. If you're using it to treat them, but not to destroy them, then that's ethical and even good. There's a separate question about germline engineering if those changes become heritable, but there are all sorts of therapeutic techniques that don't involve germline changes that are, as far as I know, basically uncontroversial and considered good by everyone and should be welcomed as a welcome thing that this type of technology has brought. But there are lots of exceptions to that where they are advanced under the banner as if they are that same kind of intervention, but they're really not. So a classic example of this is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, right? So you'll hear this talked about a lot in terms of, well, parents want to be able to give the best possible thing to their child. Well, that's basically a good sentiment and one we should largely applaud. But the way that pre-implantation genetic diagnosis works isn't by taking children who might face some deficit and helping them. It's by eliminating those children. So you diagnose ones who have genetic diseases, and you eliminate those at the embryo selection stage, which is it's a technique that frequently does come along with IVF. It isn't always accompanied with IVF. But that's where that language starts to get very slippery, and where there is a kind of once you start doing that, you open the door to other kinds of applications, right? Like maybe it's not just eliminating horrible genetic diseases like Tay-Sachs. Maybe it's things like you want to give your kid the best chance of getting into Harvard, or getting a really high paying job, or being tall and athletic, or being blonde and beautiful and desirable on the romantic marketplace. All of those are things that you can describe as wanting to give the best possible future for your child. What you're actually doing is setting conditions on which people get to come into the world and which of your children you allow into the world and which you don't. So I think that's where that form of ethical analysis and just understanding of the spirit of it, right, are we welcoming any child as a gift and then trying to help that child to the greatest extent possible, or are we setting conditions on which kinds of lives are desirable and which are not, and not allowing the undesirable lives to get a chance at life?
Yeah, that's really well said. In your article for the New York Times, you said, we persuade ourselves that designing children to match our dreams is something we do for them rather than us. We said we're kind of already living in the sci-fi world that a lot of those dystopian books have talked about. Persuading ourselves designing children to match our dreams is something we're doing for children. So can you talk to us a little bit about this idea of designer babies, and what are you seeing, and what do you think the implications of, as the technology advances and we can do right now? I think I know we can do it for gender. They're talking about maybe being able to do it for eye color and some of those things, but what are the implications of being able to completely design a child to your specifications?
I think the technology to design a child fully to your specifications in the way that is imagined in, Gattaca and sci-fi is still pretty far off. But what we have now is we have limited versions of that, and we have a pretty serious effort to normalize it, such that if the technology did improve, I think you have to assume that the default is that it would be socially acceptable. There's a terrific article that I drew on in my New York Times article, a very well reported piece in a website called The Information. It's called Dawn of the Silicon Valley Super Baby. It's published in July 2024. And it essentially reports on a raft of new startups, Silicon Valley startups, biotech startups, that are taking these kinds of paradigms of genetic selection, and they're kind of trying to give them a Web 2.0 treatment, right? So in the same way that, 20 years ago, you could go to your doctor and order a variety of blood tests on yourself and things like that. But it had to go through the doctor, and it had to go through this very formalized administrative system, and there had to be like a clear therapeutic purpose for it. And that's all been kind of consumerized. You can now do these kinds of tests at home testing kits. The same is true for at-home viral tests, which I think is a good thing. There's at-home genetic tests, that kind of consumerization. And if you go to this website, you're not going through some big bureaucratic morass with your insurance company. You're just kind of ordering a product. So to me, the main thing that is significant about these startups is that they're offering that kind of treatment, and they're also billing them as high-end luxury goods. Like, this is being appealed to as if you read the descriptions of these sites where you go to them and they have like very nice design and they're allowing you to kind of click through and select something, it's the same kind of user experience design logic as dating apps where you're swiping right and left. It's the same kind of logic as picking out your new Apple computer. The underlying technology, as far as I can tell, is not terribly advanced, but it's opening it up to a new market. It's changing the kind of consumer branding around it. There are some claims here about expanding the amount of selection, right? So there's one company in here in particular called Orchid. And the article says, in the past, similar companies sequenced less than 1% of an embryo's DNA. Orchid promises to sequence over 99% from just 5 cells, providing far greater insight into each embryo's health. The reality is that the genetic testing as it exists now, as I understand it, is still pretty limited, because most of the traits that people would want to select for involve multiple genes. They're hard to predict. The number of genes that you would want to select for that are single gene and easy to test for is still relatively limited. There are all kinds of reasons to imagine that could change. And again, to me, the significant thing about this is they're setting the vibe and the kind of they're making this into a kind of consumer marketing question rather than an ethical one, and that lays the groundwork for pretty disquieting stuff if the technology does dramatically improve.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think another way that we see kind of that shift towards a consumer-focused mindset in reproductive technologies is in your article, you mentioned kinship engineering, and
Hmm.
you draw a distinction between that and something that is truly a fertility treatment. So for our audience, can you just kind of flesh out what's the difference there? What is kinship engineering? Why is it not truly focused on treating infertility?
Yeah, so this is a term that I'm borrowing from my colleague Brendan Fote, who was previously an editor at the New Atlantis. Uh, Very, very sharp ethical analysis that he offered in this article. We published this, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, called The New Kinship Engineering. He was arguing that there are a raft of assisted reproductive technologies, current ones and prospective ones, that are talked about as if they are trying to select traits, right? As if the category that they fall under is kind of the designer baby or on the path to designer baby concern. But actually, he argues, none of these technologies are the ones that we know of already. So, three-parent embryos, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. In most cases, these technologies aren't actually necessary for a therapeutic purpose. If the therapeutic purpose is you want to have a baby, so let's say that you have, I think Tay-Sachs disease is like one of the classic examples of a genetic disease that you can pass on to your child. If you want to have a child using assisted reproduction with a guarantee, um, that it won't have Tay-Sachs disease, there are ways to do that. And it's by getting donor gametes, donor eggs, or donor sperm. Um, or there's so those are the kinds of techniques that are available. The point is that the technique is allowing you to engineer and to ensure a genetic relationship to a child that you would not be able to have otherwise. Right. So it opens up categories for people who couldn't have a genetic child at all, or for people who couldn't have a child that is genetically theirs without a very high risk of passing on a genetic disease, um, but who could have a child through other means that are available. I feel like I'm underrepresenting part of the analysis here. It's been a couple of years since I read that piece. Um, Another example that he used is mitochondrial replacement. So this is the so-called three-parent embryo, uh, which is a little bit of a weird description. I think it should be like a 2.01 parent embryo, which is somehow an even weirder concept. Uh, the DNA that we have largely exists in the nucleus of a cell. There's a small amount of DNA or RNA or something like that that exists in mitochondria. That DNA is passed along solely from the mother. So there's a lot of genetic analysis and generational analysis that's done this way because that DNA is preserved, whereas the DNA of your cell is combined from your mother and father. So there are specific kinds of genetic diseases that are only passed along through the mitochondria. Um, and the way that the treatment that is on offer for people who have those genetic diseases and want to use IVF to get around them is called mitochondrial replacement, which sounds like it means taking the mitochondria out of the egg cell and replacing it with another mitochondria. What it actually means is taking a donor egg and taking out the nucleus from that egg and inserting the nucleus from the prospective mother's egg. And then you're combining the genetic material from three people. Um, Brendan's point is that that's not needed in order to treat or avert genetic disease. That's needed to ensure a kinship relationship between the prospective parents and the child. And that is a weird, there's a kind of double talk around that, where when you are using donated eggs and sperm, that is talked about as being still a kind of full parenthood relationship through assisted reproduction. But this technology exists, and the promise of this technology is to address people in that situation who do want to have a child that is genetically theirs, who don't like the idea of using donated sperm and eggs and then just saying that the child is theirs and kind of ignoring the genetic relationship. So it's there to ensure that kinship relationship.
And is that like what's the status of that technology? Is it currently legal? Is it currently practiced? And is that the same method then that could be used for 3 or 4 parent embryos, or is that something slightly different?
Brendan is describing a kind of use case
Mm.
or a paradigm of technology, right? He's describing a specific sort of intent or purpose, right? So when I was talking before about is a technology for the benefit of an existing person and for their kind of therapeutic help, he's describing kind of another category of use that could apply to a bunch of different assisted reproductive techniques. The examples that I just mentioned all exist. So mitochondrial replacement or 3-parent embryos does exist, pardon me. The last time that I checked, I think there had just been a few reported cases of it, so it's still very early stage, but it is available. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, I'm not sure if Brendan would qualify that, or if that would qualify under that umbrella. I think that it would, and that is available and pretty widespread.
So in your article for the New York Times, you paint a couple of scenarios where you see public backlash. The way people, there's a lot of it that makes people quite uncomfortable. You think about cloning human beings. We talked about the movie The Island, where you see that clones live somewhere else and they're used for body parts. People rightly feel a sense of squeamishness or don't like those ideas. Do you think that's going to win the day, sort of the moral implications of things for people? Or do you think this is sort of a train that is just going to keep going? And like we've seen with IVF, it seems like the ethics are trying to catch up to a lot of the technology. Or do you think there's a point where people really will push back against some of these technologies and say, we're not doing it?
It's very hard to predict, and I don't want to make a prediction. What I did want to do with the article was to say that the vibes, the political coding around these technologies, it's very easy for us in our present moment to believe that these things are fixed and to not recognize that the coding and the associations of technologies can change in one direction or another. If you were in the 1950s, I think it would have been unimaginable to you that nuclear power would be disfavored and seen as a kind of devil technology by right-thinking people 20 years later. And I think it would have been very hard to predict the way that would have gone down. Nuclear technology, some people think it might be kind of back on the upswing now. And if I were to have predicted to you 5 years ago the way that was going to happen, I would not have predicted that it's because we needed to feed the gaping maw of a new artificial intelligence that's extremely power hungry, and that was going to be the thing that would kind of break us out of that. I still don't know if that's actually going to happen, but there's little glimmers of that. I don't think it's all bad or a sign of irrationality that there is a vibes component to technology. That's just sort of part of the human experience, is that it's multifaceted, and there are these different kinds of domains and practices that technology embodies, and we make these priorities about which ways of life that we want to have, and the technologies either kind of fit into those or they don't. So what I was trying to just, mostly I wanted to offer as a thought experiment that we could imagine a plausible future where the political coding changes. And it's a future that's not that different from the one that we have now. And it is one where, first of all, the political landscape per se changes a great deal, right? So right now, to be frank, I would say 95% of the public conversation about assisted reproduction just treats it as a proxy for abortion. If you're pro-choice, you're probably going to favor ART. If you're pro-life, you're going to be inclined to be against it. That kind of makes sense. Even ethically, these things are related, but they are distinct in a lot of ways. And you could imagine, so for example, you could imagine an older version of the left, one closer to the left that existed in the 60s and 70s, where ART is a lot less favored because concerns about exploitation and commodification of women's bodies come to predominate in a way that makes surrogacy seem a little icky or questionable, or in a way that makes sex-selective abortion just more salient and something that's talked about a lot. Those kinds of shifts can come about in a sort of political vibe shift. The specific shift that I imagined to try to kind of appeal to one, I wanted to speak to a readership that doesn't normally talk about these things and isn't normally concerned about them. And the specific one that I imagined is one where assisted reproduction shifts from being a kind of thing that's done by the nice couple next door. I was quoting an ethicist who used this kind of phrase, a thing that's done by the nice couple next door where you maybe feel a little strange about it, and then it seems okay, and you don't really want to kind of get involved in other people's lives. So it shifts from that kind of association to an association with a techno-futurist, post-human, post-Christian, Machiavellian tech right. And there are little ways that you can see that happening already. If you pay attention to the way that Elon Musk is building his family structure, it's actually kind of multiple families happening simultaneously with a great deal of use of assisted reproduction. To the extent he talks about this publicly, it seems to be based on his pro-natalist ideas and his ideas that the world needs to repopulate. I looked into this when I was writing this article. All of his children, except for one who died many years ago, he has, I think, 12 or 13 known children, all of whom who were created through assisted reproduction. And there are 3 different women involved, and the children are kind of being created in parallel. There are resources within centrist thought and center-left thought and old left thought for articulating why that seems strange and maybe not something that should become fully culturally normalized or celebrated. If that's the kind of the future path that this technology goes down, and especially if assisted reproduction expands through kind of glitzy Silicon Valley startups, instead of through the more kind of conventional medical system, if it's seen more and more as a luxury good and a status good than as something that's helping kind of helpless and marginal people, you could see that public coding changing. I don't know if it's going to happen, but it's imaginable.
In your article, I really enjoyed your conclusion. You said we shouldn't wait for the messiness of tech backlash. Instead, we must let ourselves see the little ways where we are already living in a world sci-fi writers imagined, a world where we persuade ourselves that designing children to match our dreams is something we do for them rather than for us, and begin setting limits now. I thought that was really good. And, kind of the overarching question in this podcast series is, what if IVF becomes a right? Looking at the potential for federal expansion of IVF that the Trump administration made promises about during the campaign trail. So with that in mind, what kind of limits should we be looking at? And where would you say we should be concerned about federal expansions to assisted reproductive technologies?
Personally, IVF is not where I would put the top focus for policy action, for the simple reason that the public does overwhelmingly support it, and we live in a democracy, and that has to be respected. If there's going to be a public referendum on that, it has to work through changing hearts and minds, and I think it has to work through changing the public vocabulary. I think that the existing language that is used to articulate concerns about assisted reproduction, it only kind of scratches at the surface of something like IVF. There isn't really a clear public reasoning way to articulate what the problem with IVF is. There are clearer ways to articulate certain kinds of technologies that often go along with IVF, like preimplantation genetic diagnosis. You can talk about the kinds of more obviously troubling technologies like designer baby tech that IVF is a necessary step to and is kind of opening up the door to. But in my view, as a strategic and a rhetorical and a moral matter, you should start with the really most clearly troubling and most articulably troubling applications. My wish list would be very serious regulations on surrogacy. A more difficult sell, but I think one worth trying for, is preimplantation genetic diagnosis, because the moral stakes of that are fairly grave in my view. And I think you also want to accompany these things with not just a restrictive approach, but recognize that most people who are using these things aren't doing so in a kind of nefarious, scheming, big tech overlord kind of way. They're doing this to address real, understandable desires people have and real medical problems that they are facing that prevent them from having children in the way that they want to. There's a couple of statements out this week. One in the New Atlantis, my magazine, was published on Monday, and another was published at First Things today, that are making these kind of overarching statements about the need for a new technology agenda, a family-focused technology agenda that should be a priority for the political right. And I think these statements do a good job of balancing the need for restrictions of these troubling outlets with the recognition that restriction is a blunt force method. It's a brutal, it's a blunt force approach. And you want to do it sparingly. And the ideal when you're doing it is when you're encouraging technology to develop down a different path, rather than when you're just trying to stop technology per se. All of which is to say that accompanying these kinds of moral limitations with grant-making priorities and scientific funding priorities that are attempting to encourage real medical breakthroughs on infertility and on treating genetic diseases, I think it's very desirable to do those things together, while understanding that doing that kind of funding is not a guarantee. That producing results of that kind is not a guarantee. So surrogacy and preimplantation genetic diagnosis, I think, would be the two that I would most prioritize. Sex-selective abortion is also, I think, worth targeting. I don't have a clear sense of what the legislative remedy for that would be, because I think it's pretty hard. You can very easily detect that at a population level. There's a lot of indication in India and China that that's happening because the sex ratios at birth are so wildly off. And there's also indication at the population level that it's happening in the United States. But I don't know of anyone who's proposed how you could appropriately detect that at an individual level, or what the policy remedy for that would be.
I was just thinking, encouraging technology the direction you want it to go versus out of fear trying to stifle and squish down. It's kind of the same with the free speech arguments, right? Like, we want the ideas to be out so people can engage, and then the crowd kind of goes with who's making the better arguments, who's making the better. So if technology, one argument is kind of taking us down this way and there's this horrible dystopian future, but another side is saying, well, no, the technology can be used to do these things, and here's some limits we can put around it. And I like what you said, and that's what our organization is all about. Changing hearts and minds has to happen more than just someone from on high saying this is the rules now and you have to do it in a representative, constitutional republic. That's not going to work in the long term. So thank you so much, Ari, for your work and your thoughts, giving our, we're just lay people, a lot of us just listening. I half of the things you're saying, sometimes I'm like, I need to Google what the definition of that is, but you're giving our listeners so many good things to think about. It's in a very measured way, not just, everybody freak out, Frankenstein is coming, run away from the technology. So we appreciate you joining us. I hope everybody enjoyed listening to this conversation. And we'll put your links and so people can find you in our show notes. But thank you, Ari, for joining us.
Terrific. Thanks very much for having me.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to another bonus episode, special edition of the Them Before Us podcast in our IVF series. Just us, TBU staff, friends, advocates, all together hanging out to chat about the latest interview. This time we're talking about our interview with journalist Ari Schulman. And my mind got blown a little bit, especially with the concept of we're approaching a future where kinship, like anybody will be able to prove they are genetically related to the individual without any regard for, does that child have a biological mother, a biological father? Will they have access to them? I think he threw out something where a single individual could be both the genetic mother and genetic father with some of this crazy technology that they're developing. So it really felt like the kind of the dystopian Brave New World, whatever, name the creepy movie kind of future. And he was like, well, I don't want to make predictions, but he's like, well, this sounds pretty scary to me. So I don't know. What do you guys think about it?
I mean, I thought he is just a wealth of information on this topic. It was great to hear from him. In vitro gametogenesis is something that it's kind of on the horizon, but people don't really talk about it. But I think Ari is right that it's a good test case for this issue, and kind of a litmus test for how far are we willing to go. And he's right in pointing out that IVG presents a completely new set of ethical concerns, where you could potentially have a child who does not have a genetic, mother or genetic father, through the use of these technologies. I learned a lot talking to him. I also really appreciated his explanation of the three-parent embryo situation, which is, a piece of it that's already happening, where you can take a donor egg and then you insert part of the intended mother's egg so that she has a genetic relationship to the child without passing on the genetic traits that she may have a family history of. And it's wild to think that that's already happening. And I think the future of that, especially when we did talk about kinship engineering, this idea of creating relationships through genetic changes, and doing that not for the sake necessarily of fertility treatment, but for the sake of engineering those relationships. I think that has implications beyond just its current use of being used for mothers with certain genetic traits. I think we could see that, maybe in the future even being pushed for, um, polyamorous groups that want to have a baby that's related to all three of them. And I think that's a consideration that we need to be keeping in mind as we're thinking about the future of these technologies.
I thought on your IBG, this like idea that we are going to take one person and make a baby out of them, it made me think of the artificial womb situation too, which where a child could potentially be gestated completely apart from human contact. And I think we're probably crazy to think that these things won't be possible at some point in the future. And it also begs the question, are we anything that's possible or anything that science brings us, is it good? And I don't think we should take that for granted. I mean, for so long, the aim of technology was to make, life easier, to make drying clothes easier, to make whatever, processing cotton into fabric easier, to make washing dishes easier. Electricity it's like all these different things made things easier. And so we've almost begun to associate technology through our whole lives as, well, it connects us. It makes all these different things. Except now, social media, we're like, well, maybe kids shouldn't have this. Maybe it's making them lonelier. Maybe it's making them more depressed. Well, when it comes to fertility, I think there's the same litmus test of, okay, could you say it's like for some people going to be more convenient for them not have to be pregnant? It's like, I could totally see some people going, well, if I can avoid that, maybe that's more convenient for me, without thinking, whoa, this is horrible. This is detaching kids. Now we're thinking, okay, well, but if I could create a kid all by myself, man, we could avoid this. Or if I could do 4 people because I really want this person to be included, or I want the best of this person, the best. And we are entering just Pandora's box right now. And him really explaining a lot of that, it did, Jen, I'm with you. It kind of freaked me out. It also reminded me how important, people who can think well about these issues are in society, to do things like we're doing, deliver good information, and help people to have an updated apologetic on this issue. How are we defending what is good, right, true, and beautiful, and keeping society from just this unending march without questioning technology into what could be, absolute nightmare situations?
Yeah, and I appreciate, Ari is not a Luddite. He's not anti-technology. He's kind of a tech guy. Like talking to him, it's like, oh, he might be a little bit of a nerd. And his background where he was, kind of studying, science and technology, and then made the shift towards journalism that he told us about. I appreciate that he highlights, there are good uses of technology. But we do have to be very careful about what we're doing with that technology, where it's going, what guidelines we have in place, before we start down this path and before we open doors to 3-parent embryos. We need to think about what are the implications.
Something I thought about when he was introducing sort of his background and what led him from the sciencey stuff into the more the journalism. And he talked about taking a class on the singularity. And this part really stuck in my mind as well. He talked about, it's the idea that the technological process is basically going to continue. It'll hit a point where then it just explodes. It goes faster, faster, faster. There will be a post-human future where we transcend the limitations of our biology, overcome death, we overcome suffering and material scarcity, and we overcome all these other limitations of our being. And I know some people are thinking that could mean you can upload your consciousness to the cloud and then live in some kind of robot, or, then you won't die in a sense. And so I'd love your thoughts on just the metaphysical of some of this as well. Those of us that work for them before us are Christian, though our organization is not religious. It's not partisan. The people who've been drawn to it and who work here happen to be Christian. And so, well, that's not unintentional, but we're Christian. And so it did make me wonder, and I didn't want to kind of poke into it in the interview per se, but it did make me wonder, if we're in a post-Christian culture in the West, where we kind of crossed over, where it's no longer just a cultural advantage to say that you're a Christian. maybe culturally a little bit more in the South. I live in the Seattle area. There's not an advantage to saying you go to church or Christian. It's not like you sort of get an extra level of trust or people think you're a good person if you say you're a Christian. If anything, you're sort of fighting against the opposite. But let's say we're in a post-Christian culture. Science is a little more the God. We talk about too, sex has become the God. My identity has become the God. And so it is interesting that for some people pursuing technology or wanting it to be better, this might be some of that mindset they're thinking of like, well, no, we're going to help preserve humanity. We're going to use technology to make the best kind of human, to make sure we eliminate death and suffering by eliminating sufferers, basically, right? Like curing Down syndrome or something. But yeah, I just wondered your thoughts about that. Do you think some of that motivation where, it's almost these like godlike qualities. If we could just continue on forever, if we could get enough knowledge, and if we could not die, that's what the apex of the human experience is supposed to be. People who are Christian don't think like that, but maybe that's the world we are approaching. And what are we supposed to do with that?
I think a piece that people don't get with transhumanism, they've got this idea we can transcend what it is to be human. But in the attempt to do so, they often lose what is good about being human. They disregard the lives of the vulnerable, and those who are vulnerable, who have fewer abilities, who need extra protection, are seen as less valuable. And I think that that's an inevitable effect of transhumanism. That you will have a disdain for those who need protections. And that's a very dangerous piece of where this kind of thinking goes. And it makes me think of like, That Hideous Strip by C.S. Lewis, and the people who are involved in that. They're not becoming better and more godlike humans. They're becoming beast-like humans because of the things that they're doing to other humans. And I think transhumanism depends on a view of people as, oh, of course, people are very good and they won't cross boundaries, and any boundaries that they do cross will be for the good of humanity as a whole, without really considering just the dehumanization that is going to come with that. If you start saying, man must transcend man.
I think the part that troubles me in our current context is if we allow that uploading our consciousness into the cloud part, which there are really smart people who need to contend with this and begin working on our kind of ethics toward it. But that does require, or it does encourage a lot of people who are just everyday people to go, yeah, exactly. I can't deal with any of this. Like, get me out of here. When there really are currently people swapping parts of embryos out to create 3-person embryos right now. That is not uploading our consciousness in the cloud. They are trying to, there's so many of these dystopic situations, chimeras. They're trying to do tests on artificial wombs. IVG is not that, it's not uploading your consciousness into the cloud far. And so we have to be careful that when we get that far down the path, it almost scares people away from thinking critically at all about our current situation. But I agree with the approach. We do have to show people where it can go without, pushing them so far out that they think this isn't really ever, this is sci-fi, and so it made me think about when Ari was saying in a democracy, without a moral framework, people can vote for whatever they want. I mean, we can amend the Constitution. It gets very difficult, but you can amend the Constitution. You could make whatever you want legal and possible in this country with enough people on board. And that's the scary part of a democracy. And the reason why the founders always thought we had to have religion and morality as the focal point, Christianity at the focal point, to have good people leading. Otherwise, you do get a situation where enough people want this, then they'll get it. And so our response then as a nation, as an organization right now, we have to go, I think there's an element of legal defense, if we have that tool to stop suffering, we should do it right away. But we can't neglect the heart by heart battle we're fighting too, mind by mind, to take these facts to people, to take these stories to people and help them to understand that this is possible. There are people who are using and abusing this technology now, and it will harm children. We need your voice. We need you to flip on this issue. We need you to advocate to your friends. Hey, support our organization. We're going to do more of this. It's kind of a two-front war here, because we live in a country where, again, it's the people that run it. And so if we don't have informed people, if we don't have good moral people, we will have only ourselves to blame when we go down a terrible path.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really appreciated Ari's point about, begin with changing hearts and minds. And, he pointed to a couple of tangible things, push back on surrogacy, which, that's kind of the original splicing into motherhood into 2 or 3 people, even without messing with anybody's cells and DNA. And then also, pushing back against, pre-implantation genetic screening. And I think, both of those are really great starting points. To be able to make people stop and think, hey, what's the future of this technology? We're not, we talked with Dr. Prentice too about, CRISPR and designer babies through that approach. But I appreciated that Ari also highlighted the designer baby thing that's already happening in the United States, because we don't have regulations where we have boutique clinics that say, yeah, we can actually pretty accurately predict your baby's eye color based on these embryos that you have, and you should pick this one if you want blue eyes. And just the dystopia that we already have that kind of gets brushed aside and hidden away, and people don't think about it. But starting there and using that to help change hearts and minds, I really appreciated his point on that.
And I liked that he wasn't saying we need to halt all technology that is anywhere in this sphere. And like you said, he's probably more interested in the science and the tech and wants us to go in that direction. And to both your points, such a great point, changing hearts and changing minds, like we have to do both at the same time. It's two-pronged. And I liked that he said we need to use the technology to go about like solving and helping fix infertility, for example. And then the question is to do it in the right way. And so, folks, I'm sure you have heard in our previous episodes, you will hear in our future episodes, some of the ways that people are doing this, are using technology to help, but actually getting to the root of the problem and helping people to be able to have children, but without all of this ethical murkiness or the things that are really, we would say outright not ethical. We should not be doing it. But it does require informing people changing their hearts, because you can't just from on high. An executive order can't solve everything, because the next person just comes in and does a different executive order, or, changing a law. We're never going to be able to change the Constitution without, what do you need? 3/5 of the states or something, so we're so far away from getting people on board with that level of agreement when it comes to some of these ethical questions. Thanks for joining us for this bonus episode, chatting about Ari Schulman's interview. And we hope you enjoyed it. We hope you're learning a lot. Email us at thembeforeus.com. If you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear back from you. Share this podcast or any of these episodes with a friend. Just help spread the word. And thanks so much for listening. And thanks for joining the movement.